Yeah, I want to welcome everybody to the history of the Commission project. And today we have John Lynch, former Senate President. Happy to have you.
Great. Pleasure to be here, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks. And Mr. Lynch was Senate President in 1989 to 1991 and Senate Minority Leader from 1991 to 97. Prior to that, he was Mayor of New Brunswick from 1979 to 1991. Former President of the Senate, went to the College of Holy Cross and to Georgetown Law School. Once again, thanks for coming in, and
my pleasure.
This is
Jeff.
really going to be helpful for our project. I want to start off with a question that I actually asked Joe Roberts, who was when he was in here as the former
Sure.
Speaker of the Assembly, and that has to do with polarization in politics.
Sure.
I had the opportunity to sit down with former Governor Kane, and he spoke highly of you and said that you had a really good relationship.
He's the best.
How have things changed since when you were in office, and in terms of that kind of camaraderie, even between the two different parties?
I mean, I think it's evolutionary. When my father was in the Senate in the 50s, 60s, before the one-man, one-vote Supreme Court decision in, I guess it was Baker versus Carr, and when they had to reapportion districts to meet equality of population in those districts. They had 21 senators by Constitution, one per each county.
Right.
So Sussex County, with very few people, had the same as Essex County, et cetera. So I think that when they called it the 21 Club, they had a lot of camaraderie. You know, they'd do their business when they had to. They'd fight during the campaigns, but they knew what they had to do, and they were pretty friendly. I think the numbers had a lot to do with that. Fast forward, however, I believe that in our time, in the 80s and 90s, there was an evolution of large partisan staffs, public relations people, big campaign operations, more money, and I think that created a bigger divide. Because there are probably, still to this day, I don't know, 12, 14 districts in the state that are in play each time. There are a lot of districts that aren't on each side of the aisle. Yeah. And those districts that are in play, 10, 12, as we just saw this past election, some changes in those districts, they are in play, and I think the partisan divide gets wider with the advent of larger partisan staffs, big campaign committees, so forth and so on. And of course, we see it around the country right now.
Right.
There's very little camaraderie. We had a lot of people that I dealt with that are great friends still to this day, and on the other side of the aisle. You don't see a lot of that anymore, although you see some. You still see that.
But not as much.
No.
Yeah, no, I remember, and coming down here as well in the 1980s, and actually before that, when I worked for a couple of the assembly people from Somerset County.
Yes.
You go out to dinner at communities or wherever.
Absolutely.
Afterwards, and both parties.
It didn't matter whether you had an R on your shirt or a D.
Yeah.
There were a lot of friendly relationships.
Yeah, exactly. Now you mentioned your father as well. He was also Senate President in 1966. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that he served for one term. And
1 year.
One year.
Yeah, he was in the Senate for 20 years.
20 years.
22 years, I think. But he served 1 year Senate President. That was the tradition.
Yeah.
And when it was a 21 Club. But when he was Senate President, I think the Democrats carried the Senate for the first time as a result of the population, change with Baker versus Carr. I think when he was Senate President, it was new. He was the first Democratic Senate President in over a half a century, because the small counties, controlled the Senate. and the Republicans
There's a
controlled most of the.
malapportionment at that time prior
yes.
to that, yeah.
So when they had to reapportion, that
Yeah.
that changed. Dick Hughes just got reelected for the second term, and my father was close to Governor Hughes. So yeah, it was a one-year term.
Yeah, what I was getting at is that, they rotated in those days. I mean,
Yes.
Senate President, Speaker, they'd serve for a term, and then someone else would come in. And
Yes.
of course, that all changed now.
Yes.
What are your feelings about that?
Well, that was a product of the 21, though, I think. And
Yeah.
I guess the Assembly did a lot of that, too,
Yeah.
even though they were proportioned population-wise. I think you're better off having the opportunity to serve for more than a year because of the continuity, the leadership skills, et cetera. Alan Rosenthal from the Eagleton was a big proponent of continuity of leadership, which is how he got into the whole campaign finance reform back in the 90s.
Yeah, and I'm not absolutely clear on this, but I guess maybe some of the issues have become more complex as well, and
Oh, yeah.
and that requires people to be in there for more than
Sure.
one term.
And you got big, you have the big nonpartisan staff, which
Right.
didn't even occur until, I guess, Sam Alito back in the 60s, father of our Supreme Court justice.
Right.
So that created more opportunity for the right kind of research and everything else in a nonpartisan way. They still are essential to the legislature to this day, and every legislature in the country, from what I gather.
Right. In 1991, there was a Republican veto-proof majority
Yes.
as a result of the election in '89.
The debacle.
Which
The debacle of 91.
and I guess that was pretty much because of the Florio taxes that went
Yes.
into effect. Now, after those taxes were enacted, I think there were like 14 new taxes that were proposed, and enacted. You actually moved at one point for repeal of those
Yes.
taxes. I wonder if you could just discuss that, and why did you do that?
Well, what happened in 1990, Governor Florio's first year, we were giving deference to them, but there was a Supreme Court case pending in the school funding cases, and it was from the Education Law Center, and they were going to win because the standards weren't being met and so forth and so on. Rather than wait for that, his so-called gurus wanted to move the whole package forward prior to the court ordering it, which was going to happen. And so, much to our regret, we passed the package. There was a total reaction. It was following the assault weapons ban, and the NRA came together with what was called Hands Across New Jersey, and they created a big movement. People in our caucus were having trouble getting to Trenton without getting accosted in various ways. It was quite stunning, and so we then moved to, in 1991, to do the QEA 2, Quality Education Act 2, because the fundamentals of tax were being funding the Quality Education Act, which was to meet the Abbott versus Burke standards. And what it turned out is the $2.9 billion, so much it was going to schools and not being put in any kind of a check. There was no control over spending. Mm-hmm. So we put in a package that we called QEA 2, did some other education reforms, but pushed up about close to $1 billion against a cap tied to a national deflator on cost of government services, et cetera. And that created a brouhaha with the NJEA. They hated the cap. They didn't want any part of it. And we needed to reverse what had happened with QEA 1 and the unbridled spending. And it went into effect. It actually was effective for a year, but by then we were gone, and they put holes in it, and that was the end of it. So I think the following year, 1992, property tax year 1992, the property taxes across the state were almost flat as a result of that. But that that we weren't unraveling the public opinion in the 1991 elections. We lost 40% of our members.
Yeah, I remember that movement. I mean, that was probably the first statewide movement that hands across New Jersey.
Yeah, and remember the NRA is very effective.
Yeah.
And they used that as the cover, and they were very effective everywhere in the state with money behind them.
Sure.
Wayne LaPierre, the whole thing.
Yeah.
And they were very effective at mobilizing.
Mm-hmm. Now, speaking about the veto-proof majority, one of the things that I recall from the 1980s was that the Republicans, who were in the minority much of that time,
Yes.
at that point, were talking and pushing the idea of initiative and referendum.
Yeah, sure.
Just to explain what initiative and referendum is, basically the people have the opportunity through getting enough signatures on a petition to actually get questions on the ballot. And the Republicans at that time were pushing that very hard. But once they got control in 1991, they were unable to do that. And that must have something to do with that gubernatorial veto being very
They
powerful.
didn't want any part of it. It was a facade, which it took us too long to understand, that the people who were most opposed to initiative referendum, and not that it's a great idea, because look at what happened with the California props. Everybody got what they wanted. They tied joint interests together. The public was left out. And you created a whole new cadre of political consultants and signature gatherers and everything else.
Yeah,
and
right.
Things worked out pretty wild in California. Here, what we finally realized was, however, when the Republicans did get control of the State House after Governor Whitman was elected, that they still had this bill in both houses, and they still talked about it from time to time. But we finally became aware, it was clear that the NRA was against it. They were for them. The medical societies were against it. They were for them. The NJEA was against it. At that point, they were on their side. The Chamber of Commerce was against it. The Business and Industry Association was against it, and so many other organizations. We said, well, you know what? We told the Republican leadership, we'll post half the votes in committee to get it out of there, and we'll give you half the votes on the floor to pass it. They pulled the bill and never saw it again.
Right.
So it was, they were getting the best of both worlds.
Yeah.
Telling the public they were for it, we were against it. At the same time, where they were getting their funds from, campaign funds and everything else, they weren't for it.
And you brought up an interesting question as well, too. I mean, you mentioned California, and usually their ballots are like a telephone book
Yes.
every year,
Yes.
with all the questions that they have on there, and it opened up a new business for consultants.
Oh, absolutely. And new ties between, like, remember the Prison Guards Union and one of the other organizations joined together, even though they weren't on the same page. You support this, I'll support this, none of which was in the best interest of the taxpayers. So it became a special interest vehicle because they had the money. Mm-hmm. They hired the consultants, and the average citizen was on the sidelines.
Yeah, exactly. And you mentioned the NJA, and of course they're very powerful politically and have continued to be. And now they fund a group by the name of Garden State Forward, which is really an independent group. In 2017, I mean they spent millions against Senator Sweeney.
Yeah.
And
a lot of millions.
A lot of millions. And I know you back in the
91.
early 91 had opposed the NJA, and they ran quite a campaign against you.
That was all because of the QEA2 and the caps.
Yeah.
And but they created this political vehicle you just referred to, where, remember, they received well north of $150 million a year from dues. It doesn't matter whether you're a member of the union or not. You have an automatic payment to the state EA, the county EA, and a local EA, whatever municipality you happen to be teaching in. And that generates $150, $160 million a year, which is really coming from the taxpayer. So the average person in the school system is paying over $1,000 a year in those dues, out of which they raise over $150 million. They spend on a political vehicle north of 70, 75, $80 million now each year, and which is much more than any interest organization in the state, the unions or anybody else, any other union, et cetera. So they have become the 300-pound gorilla, for lack of a better term. As a result of that, there's never been a check in the system as to how they spend their money, why they have this, can have this political vehicle, because they're funded through an automatic payment, compliments of the state.
Right. Now, I'm not completely, I have to look at this, but I think the U.S. Supreme Court in the Janus decision kind of might have impacted that a little bit.
It did, but you're still going to, unless you opt out,
right,
which you have to do, and it's very difficult to do for the average employee of the school system, whether it be the custodians or ministerial people, et cetera, not to mention the teachers, who probably would be better off if they had their own union, independent of the other groups.
Right, exactly. Would you still take that position today? That you took in 1991?
I believe so, but they've gotten more powerful as time goes on.
Right.
What the problem is, of course, is that most people will stand up. And as in the case of Senator Sweeney, if you get 50% of the people in the legislature on both sides of the aisle standing up to them, they disappear in terms of their power. And they also would put a check in the system as to how they get their money and how they spend their money, because you can't tell you can't tell what's happening as a member of the public. You're seeing these nice TV commercials, how wonderful everything is, and what they need and what they don't need. And there's nothing wrong with that issue of advocacy, but when it's a huge amount of money and it's coming from, in essence, the taxpayer, that's a problem.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. You know, and one of the things that I just wanted to ask you about, you know, we mentioned Garden State Forward as being an independent group, and that the spending by these independent groups, and I've always said they have the perfect right, First Amendment right to participate in the campaigns, but they have totally eclipsed political parties in terms of their influence over the campaigns. And we just saw in this recent election how 2 districts were targeted. There were about $6.5 million in independent groups just spent in District 2 and 8.
Wow.
You know, so they do target these groups.
Oh, sure.
And they spent between the legislative and gubernatorial campaign about $55 million this year on the campaign.
And that will grow and grow and grow.
And it's continued to grow. So I would like to hear your feelings on this development.
The question is, how do you really gain control over them? You know, most of them are aligned with a political party or a political candidate or a political organization. Most of them. And today, of course, you have the enormous disparity in wealth in this country. We got multi-billionaires, and being a millionaire today doesn't really cut it when it comes to those people who have hundreds of billions of dollars, you know, and so that disparity creates all of these problems on a national level that spill over here with dark money and independent expenditure groups and 501c4s, 5s, et cetera. So it's really difficult to get your arms around it. You have an enormous task, because the wishful thinking is, you know, Citizens United would be overturned and all these things would be exposed, but we're not going to see constitutional amendments or Supreme Court cases turning back the clock. It's not going to happen.
No, I agree with you. And I always
which
say
makes your
that,
task much more difficult.
well, it does in terms of trying to get that disclosure out there, you know, in terms of what we try to do. But I always go back to the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act in 2002 as a real catalyst for the growth of these groups, because what we found is that, at least on the national level, between Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act and Citizen United, there was over 1,000% growth in these groups.
Oh,
And then
sure.
Citizens United facilitated it. So we have a double whammy there that,
Yeah.
you know.
And if things keep going on the wealth side, and logic tells you that it's going to continue to grow, and what we've seen in the last 10 years is phenomenal in terms of the wealth disparity, the people that are multi-billionaires and who fund these dark money organizations, independent expenditures, nonprofits, whether it be the Koch brothers or it doesn't matter,
Exactly.
both sides of the aisle.
It could be one billionaire that funds everything.
Yes.
And,
Sometimes their own campaign, as we saw a governor or two in this state.
yeah.
And that's another issue, but that's clearly nothing to do about that.
Yeah, no.
And sometimes you wind up with somebody as good as Michael Bloomberg in New York,
Right.
who is there for the right reason, has nothing to do with his ego, and he wants to put New York on the right path for the next
Right.
40 years, which he did. He won't get credit for it for a long time.
And he sure spent a lot of money.
He spent
on
a
his
lot
own
of money. And he spent his own money to bring in people to his think tanks to help the government, to plan out the infrastructure over the next 40 years, the schools, you name it, and really super planning mechanisms. And most of the people don't understand what he did, water systems, et cetera. But the historians in 40, 50 years are going to paint the picture of he was probably the best thing ever happened in New York City.
Yeah. No, he was a good mayor.
Yeah.
No doubt. And he spent a lot of
And
his...
he was there for the right reason.
Right. Exactly. One of the things that I, had mentioned that when consistent with the growth in independent spending was a decline in political parties. This is something I've been writing about for several years, and I'm a big proponent of political parties. What are your
Well,
overall
do you think
feeling?
they really are? Because so many of these expenditure groups are tied to the party leadership. Just take in New Jersey, there are strong political organizations on both sides. Certain counties have really strong leadership, and they bring in the right consultants, lawyers, whatever, how you raise your money correctly, and so forth and so on. I think the political parties were strengthened in the first instance back in the early 90s when the first way was because up until the 1991 when the U.S. Supreme Court decided that the government couldn't regulate the parties, and they could set dates for elections and things like that, but unless it violated the Constitution, you can't regulate them. And up until then, New Jersey had a law, and the courts enforced it, that the parties couldn't endorse in a primary. And so, fast forward, it was not long thereafter, we saw the McGreevey-Andrews race for primary for governor in 1997 with Whitman as an incumbent. And a lot of people said Andrews had the edge because he had a big congressional district. But the fact was, what was important that year was the big counties, big Democratic counties, who had the line, who had the regular organization Democrat line in, say, Middlesex County or Hudson County or Essex County, et cetera. And it was really close because South Jersey was with Andrews, and Hudson County went with Andrews as well. So then it became a really close contest because the playing field was pretty level. But those county lines, if you look at what happened that year in the primary elections in those counties, the lines held. They won big.
No, you're absolutely right. And I remember the conventional thinking at that time was if you had a congressional district, that you were bound to win the gubernatorial primary or the nomination. Yeah. And because I had done a study on and saw that the county parties and the political parties in general were getting much stronger as a result of the Rosenthal,
Yes,
reforms.
it was Rosenthal, but it was also the fact that the Supreme Court said the states couldn't regulate the lines, because that party line, up until then, for the 40, 50 years before that, had been open. You couldn't endorse. The Middlesex County Democrats couldn't endorse a candidate in a primary. And they couldn't give them the regular organization line in the primary, which is very, very important in a Democratic primary.
And that ended with the 1989 Supreme Court decision in the San Francisco Democratic
I think that was
Committee,
yes.
and then our Attorney General here made a determination that our open primary law was
Yes.
unconstitutional.
And they clearly
as
were,
well.
The the independent legislative commission that analyzes these things, they wanted to take it off the
Yeah.
books. For some reason, the party chairman in both parties didn't want it to come off the books because it's confusing. We've had lawsuits where courts have decided in favor of the old law
Yeah.
without knowing of the Supreme Court opinion.
Right.
We had cases go to the appellate division, and it should have been repealed. It should be off the books.
Yeah.
Because they can endorse. I'll bet you get more cases where people take that issue to the courts because a lot of people don't know it.
Yeah, no, that's very true. Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing, you see parallels in decades and so forth. In the 1980s, the parties were really weak, partly because of what
Yes.
you were saying. Parties couldn't
Yes.
endorse
Yes.
candidates, couldn't give the line to their candidates in the primary or support them in any way. And it's kind of similar to what's happening now with the independent groups versus
Oh, yeah.
the political
That's
parties.
very true.
And then you had the Rosenthal reforms, which we mentioned, and I know your caucus at the time supported the reforms, which included contribution limits and the established leadership committees, and also probably the most important thing they did was to strengthen the parties, because in the 90s,
Yes.
that's when
Oh,
it really
absolutely.
took off. And as you were saying about the McGreevey, effort in, what was it, 97?
Yep.
I guess it was because
Yes.
of getting the county line.
County lines, yes.
Yeah.
See, Alan was a good friend, and he was probably the foremost student of state legislatures in the country. Wrote 8, 10, 12 books,
Yeah,
whatever.
right,
Visited every
exactly.
legislature, worked with almost every
Yeah.
legislature. It was his feeling that and if you'll see it, is how it's expressed in that so-called reform, that you wanted strong leadership in the legislature. Him being a student of the legislature, that was his main mission. So you had these leadership PACs that became very large, and everybody else had limitations. Funding the members through the leadership created continuity and built strength of leadership, and that was his main goal. He achieved it.
No, he did.
He achieved it. Now, was he right or wrong? People will debate that, but the fact is, it was beneficial in the big picture.
Yeah, and you actually, as I recall, I mean, you had informal leadership PACs in the 1980s, but then they were actually put into law.
But you had more limitations.
Yeah.
In his world, and what we did, was limit the size of the individual contributions to your campaign committee, et cetera, and elevate the leadership
Yeah,
PACs.
exactly.
So you would be beholden to the leadership PACs, and a lot of money could be raised through that vehicle to fund campaigns, mostly in those 12 or 14 districts that I referred to earlier, where they were up for grabs.
Now, that was a question I asked Joe Roberts, and he agreed that it was a good thing that the leadership PACs were created, because it created greater discipline within the
Without
party
question.
in terms of getting.
And it also created longevity in the leader.
Right, that's true.
As Donnie
That's a good point.
DiFrancesco proved immediately, and he used it, and his people around him used it very effectively. And he probably could have stayed as leader for even a lot longer. But he was proof positive of the effectiveness of what Alan was looking to achieve.
Yeah, he was always a big supporter of the legislature.
Yes,
Alan
oh,
Rosenthal,
big time.
no
And
question
of course, he
about it.
became the 11th member in state reapportionment, and
Reapportionment,
13th member in the congressional
Right.
redistricting.
Yeah.
And yes, because he was trusted by both sides.
Yeah. We were talking about those Rosenthal reforms, and later on in 1996, you supported further reforms, and I have a quote from you here at the time that I just want to read to show you how you were supportive disclosure. As I believe this was from the Star Ledger. as Senator Minority, you said, as Senate Minority Leader, you said, current laws have done little to address fears that the public is becoming more detached from the governmental process. Without reforms, the public interest will continue to be buried under the weight of the special interest cash, the access it buys, and the muddied finances in campaign advertising. And basically, what you went on to recommend was a gift ban on lobbyists, disclosure of executive branch lobbying, and disclosure of grassroots lobbying as well. And grassroots lobbying, again, is an attempt to mobilize the public rather than the old traditional
Yes.
lobbying where a lobbyist would directly communicate with a member of the legislature or the executive branch. Now you have wealthy, well-heeled interests that are running advertisements and so
Big
forth,
time.
trying to mobilize the public, and
for
it's
sure.
become very effective. So you've always been kind of on the side of disclosure.
Well, as you know, you see it probably more than anybody, the key to all this is transparency. And one of the problems we have today is transparency in many instances is gone when it comes to the dark money, when it comes to the 501c4s, 5s, etc. It's very difficult to track the money, and the wealth disparity makes it even more difficult for the public who aren't participants in that world. So if you could go back to the origin of the ELEC in the 70s or whatever it was, hindsight is always 20/20, of course. You probably would change the way you went about this whole thing if you could read the tea leaves, what the Supreme Court was going to do, what was going to happen with the
Sure.
501c4s and all,
Sure.
and try to give more opportunity to raise money with transparency. We were putting limitations on raising money, which created this opportunity or creativeness for people in the political world to circumvent all of that and go in a different direction. And it's kind of like water finds its way, and political money finds its way.
Yeah, we call them loopholes. There's always loopholes that have
And now
to
there's
sort of be closed.
now there's some gaping ones,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
So I guess you kind of, you were talking about we're switching gears a little bit and talking about lobbyists, and one of the things that you had, as I had mentioned, proposed was that lobbyists should, disclose their contributions and their expenditures. And that's something that still remains to be
Yes.
enacted. You
Yes.
still feel strongly about
sure.
about that. Yeah.
Well, you can see their client lists
Right.
on matters involving the legislature, not necessarily the regulatory side, but the legislative side. If they're retained to propel or be proponents of legislation to oppose legislation, you kind of know where it's coming from. And if they're raising big money and spending big money on the candidates with that legislation in mind, there's a little bit of transparency.
Yeah.
You can connect the dots, but so many other areas
But
today.
the average person isn't going to connect
no,
the dots.
no.
That.
No, but if you're on the other side of the issue, you will.
I know in some of the other states they do have that law
Yeah.
where they actually require lobbyists to actually report their contributions.
I think they
in terms of
should.
campaigns.
Absolutely.
So, that
No
hasn't
question.
taken place
No,
yet.
I agree with you.
in
It should
Jersey.
happen.
Yeah. Another proposal that you had made was to have legislative public financing, and I guess that was early '90s too. As well that happened, and that you had modeled that your proposal after our public
Yes.
gubernatorial public financing program was a matching program. Which was quite different than the clean elections program that came
Right.
later
Right.
in 2005, which was a pilot program, and that's all. It didn't. That's all it was a pilot program, and then it kind
Yes.
of died. One of the reasons it died was because the Supreme Court
Yes.
looked at the Arizona law that was similar to ours, and basically said you can't level the playing field. That's
I
unconstitutional.
forgot that we had the pilot. I did.
Yeah, but the matching program would have.
It wouldn't work with the bigger counties and candidates, et cetera, you know, but because of their need for a lot more money than you would ever be able to do on matching funds, it seems to me.
Mm-hmm.
But it would be very beneficial in races to bring people into the system running for office who didn't have the resources and could get a little bit of help on and, you know, running a campaign, everything else, whether it be at the local level, the county level, or even in some cases these states, the counties that are districts that are all blue or all red.
Sure.
The other party, you can, you know, really, and it's like going to the minor leagues and learning your way around and growing with it. So creating opportunities for people who are getting started, who have real interest, I think it was be effective there.
Yeah, no, I think and the thing with a matching program is, you know, a candidate could opt out of it if they wanted to, like our
exactly.
gubernatorial program,
Exactly.
which with the clean elections program,
Yes.
people, you know, you had to reach a certain threshold, raising $10 denominations, which turned out to be really difficult for people to raise that money.
That's not realistic.
You know, but it was you know, it was a good try, and
But I thought, you know, if you can entice more people to run for office who have real interests and something to offer, but they're not in the right venue, but they can grow and mature.
Yeah.
It's healthy for the state. We want more people involved in the election process, I think.
Yeah. You know, interestingly, that's an idea that hasn't come up lately in terms of legislative public financing, but. You know, but you know, there have been some who would say that even the gubernatorial program isn't useful anymore because of the independent groups. But I maintain it's probably more worthwhile these days because it does give, you know, a candidate of limited means an opportunity to at least get their message out against these groups.
I agree, absolutely.
You know,
we've seen some of that.
Yeah,
it is definitely beneficial.
I mean, we just saw that in this recent election.
It's not yesterday's news. I think it's a reality that it's beneficial.
Yeah,
It may not be taken advantage of as much as once was anticipated, but it still has real luck.
I mean, we saw what is it, 2009, where then Governor Corzine spent $30 million, and Christie took public financing and spent $10 million and won.
Well, Corzine spent $65 million in 2000 to get a Senate seat.
Senate seat, right?
Because he had a primary against Florio and a general election against Bobby Franks.
Yeah.
And he spent $65 million to not sure to what end. I think he's the opposite of what Bloomberg is and was.
Yeah, I mean,
what's the mission?
His own money, you know, to get that Senate seat. Yeah, and then to get a governor's seat too.
Absolutely.
What was it, 2005? Yeah.
But his motives still are somewhat, you know, shady. We don't know what his motives were. Was it all ego? I'm not sure. Because I didn't see his mission. He didn't come here with a mission of, here's what I'm for, here's what I want to do, and here's where I think we're gone wrong, and I'm going to spend my own money to move that ball forward like Bloomberg did. I think it's almost the opposite.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I guess the people felt that way in
2009.
You know, again, getting back to political parties, we here at the commission have made a number of recommendations to strengthen the parties, and one of them would be to do away with this or to allow political county parties to give money to each other, to transfer money to each other, and or contribute money. And of course, there still is in effect this idea of you can't wheel money around, and there's a prohibition against the parties being able to do that. We've recommended that, but groups like the Women's League of Voters and so forth are still opposed to that.
Yeah.
Even though things have changed. I mean, the electoral landscape has changed with these independent groups.
Absolutely.
One of the things that you had done back in the day was to establish a PAC. It was called New Directions.
Right.
And you were very much involved in, I guess, the Bergen County race.
Bergen, Ocean, Monmouth,
All over.
Somerset.
Yeah.
We were trying to party build with it.
Yeah.
And it became more obvious in some areas rather than others. But for instance, in Ocean County, where the Democratic Party has been weak for a long, long time, we had some leadership on the ground in individual counties. We took control of the 5 largest populated counties in Ocean County. But we could never penetrate the county party because we didn't have strong leadership.
Yeah.
You have to have both, as it turns out. In Bergen, we wound up with a pretty strong leader, albeit it's controversial, but that strength of leadership is critical. I think it's critical to a corporation, it's critical to a university, it's critical to the New York Yankees. Leadership is critical.
And that's kind of ironic because what you were trying to do with New Directions was to strengthen the parties.
Oh, absolutely.
Whereas the law effectively was weakening
Yes.
the parties. I mean, it just seems to me that that law ought to be changed so that parties can help
Yes.
each other.
Oh,
in
absolutely.
strengthening
No question
the
about
parties.
it. Party building is critical.
Yeah.
Finding leadership is critical. And, we experienced a lot of that by going place to place. Certain of the growth towns in Somerset, for instance, we put a dent in, and some of that's meaningful today as things are transpiring. But Ocean County, which is a huge Republican county these days, we had an opportunity to create something, but just couldn't find strong county leadership.
Mm-hmm.
Even though they were individuals on a
Yeah.
local level who were good candidates, good policy, they got elected, but translating that into a county political organization, very difficult.
Yeah, if the parties had been stronger, if this wheeling or parties contributing to each other
Yes.
at that time would have been allowed, would you have worked through the party rather than?
That's a
New
good question.
direction.
I've never really analyzed it as to how it's hard to get a county organization to really
Yeah.
do party building in another county, as opposed to just supporting a candidate in another county where you want to support a legislative seat in that county, and you'd like to push money into it through the county organizations and leadership PACs in a county because they have the same essential basic rules as a Senate President's leadership PAC.
Sure. Sure.
They can raise substantial money.
Yeah. No. Exactly. Just returning to this was another proposal that you had made, which is really interesting because you had proposed, I guess it was in around the 1993 time with the Rosenthal reforms, that you had proposed an $1,800 contribution across the board to candidates, to political parties, to leadership committees, and everything else. And of course, we have a very complicated scheme of contribution limits. It's hard for me to keep them all in my head. And they change every 4 years, and then
if not impossible.
You're trying to, what's the one for political parties? What's the one for candidates, and so forth. So I always have a chart there so I can refer to. But that seems like a good idea. Is that something you still would support, that kind of cross the board?
I'm not sure it's realistic here with the current vehicles for pushing money into a race. And it certainly would level the playing field if you could have it become meaningful. But there's so many alternatives for funding a campaign.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the problems that we have today, particularly from a disclosure agency.
Yes.
We're trying to keep track of all this.
It's very difficult. You have so many. How many towns we have? 566 and 21 counties. It's very difficult.
Yeah.
But your ELEC is still an important vehicle to keep basic controls in place, to make people play by rules, and to provide transparency as much as you can. But if there was a vehicle to provide transparency across the board, I wouldn't be concerned about how much money a person is donating. If you're donating, you're pay to play, and it's
Sure.
it's black and white. No, you can't hide.
I mean, that's the thing with here, we here at ELEC. I mean, I think we have probably the widest jurisdiction of any commission of its type in the nation. I mean, in addition to,
Yes.
the regulation of candidates, financial activity,
Sure.
but the political parties and PACs, and then we have pay to play, and we oversee fundraisers and the gubernatorial public
Sure.
financing. I don't think any other agency has the kind of
I think you're right.
broad jurisdiction
I've
that
never
we
seen
have.
any evidence of that. Right.
And so trying to get disclosure, particularly in this age of independent groups. I mean, we actually contract with an advertising consultants who gets all that kind of information, for us, so that
Sure.
we can
Oh,
kind
yeah,
of get an
sure,
idea how
sure.
much they're spending. That's
Yes.
the only way we can do it.
No, it's tough.
To try to keep the public apprised of
There's so many
what's
vehicles.
going on. Yeah. And my deputy director, Joe Donnie, who put on his reporter's cap this past election,
Good
and was
man,
keeping
Joe.
everybody
Yeah.
up to date on a day-to-day
Absolutely.
basis,
Right.
which is
No, his background is perfect.
yeah, we think that's an important role that we have here. I think I would probably be remiss without asking a little bit about New Brunswick Tomorrow, because, at this point, in the interest of disclosure, I'm gonna, wanted to talk about the 1974 campaign for mayor, which I helped out on in 1974, and then worked for the city of New Brunswick for about 2 years, after that. And New Brunswick Tomorrow really came about, I think, as a result of that election. It was called For Your Future in 1974.
Exactly.
And you were the campaign manager,
Yes.
Dick
Yes.
Mulligan, who
Yes.
got elected mayor. And just talk a little bit about, that was against the establishment. That was against, I guess, Patty
Yes.
Sheehan and Al
Pat Sheehan,
Cooper and
exactly.
that
Yes.
group. And
Yeah, they had not been involved. They had not taken over until just before the change in the form of government from commission to strong mayor. That happened in '70, but
Yeah.
they took control of a commission form in '67, and so it wasn't that much longer before we ran the Mulligan in the general election of '74,
74, yeah.
because we didn't see any way to win a primary, and we didn't have time, and so we didn't catch a spark until that summer after the primary, and we're able to succeed. Now, Al Cooper, who passed away not too long ago, is a wonderful friend, great guy, and but we wound up on opposite sides for some, both with some legitimate disagreements. So, but in that same time frame, Johnson & Johnson and their then leader, chairman, CEO Dick Sellers, who was Somerset County resident,
right.
who was a very talented man, and he had a real interest in seeing J&J stay in New Brunswick and evolve the town into something meaningful. And he was the best person I ever worked with in the New Brunswick environment. He had no personal agenda. He wanted to see the town grow.
Yeah.
We used American Cities in Maryland to do some planning. And then we, did a lot of things together. And he was unbelievably fine man to work with. And of course, he enjoyed a great position with J&J. He was close to real close to Christy Whitman's mother and father. And he had so he understood the political world as well. You go forward from that, the corporate model has changed dramatically. So they don't want to be involved in local politics. They'll give you soft money for, organizations, charitable organizations, et cetera, et cetera. Not that it's not meaningful, it is, but being directly involved in planning and reorganizing and bringing things to bear, he was unique.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if anybody's been to New Brunswick lately, but it's a real renaissance.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I can remember, when I worked there during the 2 years, you'd leave at 5 o'clock and the streets would be empty.
Roll 'em up.
It was a ghost town.
Yeah.
And now, I mean, it's thriving. And
You know,
and really, so much of it is due to you with your efforts. Others people as well,
but as you know, it's the perception of New Brunswick that it was down and out, and
right.
the central business district was gone. There was nothing there, as a practical matter. So changing the perception of the town was critical.
Yeah.
Getting some things started was critical, and that's where he was very helpful with. And then in those days, we had to do a lot of eminent domain for redevelopment projects, and that created a firestorm with the media, not so much with the citizenry, who were, whether they be tenants or owners, they were more than well
And that was
compensated.
before that Supreme Court decision.
Yes.
Queso was it
Yes.
Queso? I think it
Yes.
was, where a private developer could actually buy private land, and it was for the public good. But
Yes.
prior to that, it was always
Yes.
a governmental agency. I think.
But now there's a lot of restrictions through the courts, et cetera, on eminent domain, so the tests are much different. But it still gets done
Right.
where needed. Atlantic City refused to do it when they got off the ground after the constitutional amendment, and that much to their regret, I believe, because they needed to really change the environment. They needed to make it a resort destination, and they refused to do it. And so as a result, you come forward from 1977 constitutional amendment, Byrne time to make Atlantic City have gaming permitted right in that time frame.
I think it was 75, 76,
Right in
around
there,
there.
yeah.
Yeah.
So and they contributed in the first instance by not doing the right things to ensure that the town could become what it was meant to be, and that's a resort destination as a consequence of what happened in Atlantic City in New Jersey with the voter change. Las Vegas changed their whole MO and went to a resort destination game, which New Jersey was probably most responsible for.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Because they knew the catchment area in New Jersey was like 100 million people, and theirs wasn't anywhere near that.
Yeah, yeah, I know. The Atlantic City, that referendum first went down. The first time around, but then the second time around, there was a lot of money spent by some of the interests down there.
They made some mistakes the first time.
Yeah, but eventually it did get
One of the
through.
mistakes they made in some places, where it was attempted before, is they forgot about you have to get the host community to vote for it.
Yeah.
So you could win statewide 2-1 and lose the host community, and you couldn't get it.
Having been so involved, obviously, so principally involved with New Brunswick Tomorrow, do you have any suggestions for Trenton? Because Trenton really
It's very frustrating.
needs to be revitalized. It's
Leadership.
got a lot of opportunities.
Leadership. You got to have business leadership. You have political leadership. There were opportunities in Trenton, and I don't want to point fingers, but there were missed opportunities to get the ball rolling. And as I said about New Brunswick before, you need to change in the first instance the perception. Security, visually seeing things taking place, brick and mortar is important. Planning is important. How you show that where the development's going to evolve from and how, and the central business district, the waterfront, and so forth and so on is a natural in Trenton. But they missed some real opportunities, and the state's not been a willing partner. Although there were times when they probably would have been if they were pushed correctly by the county and, more importantly, city leadership.
I always thought that to take advantage somehow of the Revolutionary War
Big
history.
time. Absolutely. And that was part of what had been proposed in some cases, coming in from the waterfront and getting into all the historic world, making something more attractive out of that. And so many people don't even know what is there.
Yeah, sure.
From a standpoint of history, it's amazing.
Yeah.
But there's so many stories. But again, it's perception. And once you get momentum, and people start paying attention, and aren't afraid to come into the community, and they don't everything doesn't close after 5 o'clock. That's a big problem.
I think Henry Kissinger said perception is reality in
Big time.
politics. And,
than it is in when it comes to community development. You either believe it's happening or don't. That was our biggest problem in New Brunswick, convincing the people first in Central Jersey that New Brunswick was something that you didn't think it was, and that they had momentum going. And of course, once you have momentum, then a lot of good things happen.
Sure.
Yeah, I have to keep it. We used to have people complain, "Oh, you're building another parking deck." Well, the day you stop needing more parking is the day you stop living and progressing.
Yeah, I mean, it's still going on today. I mean,
Absolutely.
Every time I
Big
drive
time.
through there, you
Big.
know, it's
It's not going to stop.
right. Exactly. I mean, it's just a great renaissance that took place.
Yeah.
Again, as I said. Before I conclude, I want to talk a little bit about New Brunswick-St. Peter's rivalry in sports.
Speaking of Al Cooper,
Speaking of Al Cooper, was a really good basketball player too. At New
played for
Brunswick,
UConn,
New Brunswick High, and then went on to play at UConn. Well,
yes,
you were at St. Peter's, and
Right.
St. Peter's no longer
No.
exists, unfortunately.
compliments of the diocese.
Yeah, right. But you had played basketball, you know, and the one thing, you know, with the rivalry in New Brunswick, and you know, I played basketball and baseball
Sure,
at,
of course.
at New Brunswick, and we only were able to beat you in basketball one time, and that was when Samoji was actually playing. We beat him my senior year. That one game, but we were a little better than you in baseball.
Yeah.
But you were St.
absolutely.
Peter's was always better
Absolutely.
in basketball.
They always had really good baseball. When I was there, of course, both schools were very large. Brunswick was Group 4, and they played big-time baseball. They won the Greater Newark tournament, which in baseball, when I was a senior, that was effectively what would consider today the Group 4, Group 5 championship statewide. So they had really good programs, and New Brunswick High School was a catchment area for 7, 8, 9 towns back in the 50s. St. Peter's was a catchment area for 4 counties back in the 50s. So when I think when I graduated, my brother, St. Peter's had like 1,400 kids in the school, high school. That's a lot.
Yeah.
Big. Then they wound up with 200 or whatever.
Well, your basketball team went to the finals or something.
Oh,
right?
yeah. Oh, absolutely.
The parochial.
Yeah, we lost to St. Peter's, Jersey City, at the old Jadwin Gym at Princeton.
Oh, yeah. Played there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it was always a great rivalry, and
Big
I
time.
remember
Basketball and
basketball and baseball.
and
Like
baseball,
I said,
no doubt.
St. Peter's was better in basketball, and I think New Brunswick was better
Historically,
in baseball.
that's
historically,
true.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you know, again, I want to thank you for taking the time to come in and
My pleasure.
be interviewed. It's really been a pleasure, and I think once again very beneficial to what we're trying to do here, which is kind of chronicle a little bit of New Jersey history, but mainly focused on campaign financing. And you know, as I've mentioned, all of our interviews are archived, and this interview with former Senator Lynch will be up in about a week, I guess. And again, thank you very much for coming in.
Jeff, it's my pleasure. It's good seeing you as always.
Right. Thanks.
And keep up the good work here.
We'll try.
You got it.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Right.